Quick disclaimer before you listen. The World's Okayest Medic Podcast is an educational and commentary platform produced and recorded by me. What we say on here is not endorsed by any of our employers, and we are not speaking on behalf of our employers. Our commentary is our own. Finally, remember to follow your local protocols.
So I have been plugging this HEMS panel where we're going to talk about operational the safety stuff, utilization, because there have been far too many helicopter crashes. It seemed like there were a lot of crashes several years ago, and it seemed like we trailed off for a little bit, thankfully. And now it seems like a helicopter's falling out of the sky every couple of months. And there's lots of problems with the industry, I think. Problems is probably the right word. Anyway, I'll stop rambling. So Sal is new to the podcast. You guys have been on before, but I think real quick, we should do a quick introduction to show that just what your experience is in the flight EMS world, just so everybody knows who everybody is in case you're new listening to the podcast. And Sal, why don't you go first since you're new? You're also the farthest away. We got some West Coast representation here. And just so people know, Sal and I are going to do a podcast just with him where we talk about his background, which is awesome. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on, Mike. I am a 27-year career highway patrol officer, retired as a sergeant, but a portion of my career, about 8 years, was actually as a flight officer paramedic in one of our 7 regional helicopters in the state. And so unlike air ambulance type of facilities or programs that existed here in California, that's what they call it. The bulk of what I did was law enforcement, search and rescue. And then because my particular helicopter operated out of what we call Valley Division, it was 13 counties within Northern California. We would pretty much go airborne, and then I would monitor radios and respond to, vehicle accidents, et cetera. Occasionally there was a violent crime that required us to respond to, where we would actually land and transport someone out. But a large percentage of what I did was law enforcement type work. And then, which really required that I stay sharp because I probably flew alone. I rarely ever took a second person. It was just my partner and myself, maybe 4 medevacs a month. And so a lot of the meat and potatoes type medicine that a lot of ambulance people do when it's just trauma. So airways and IVs, et cetera. Hopefully much of the work was done prior to we getting the patient, because limited space, not a lot of opportunities for hanging lines and things like that. But that was kind of the bulk of what I did, and I did that for about 8 years until I had my moment, after a number of other moments where, like, I think all my 9 lives had come and gone, and I was ready to stop flying, and that's what happened.
Well, welcome. Dan, you're probably the oldest one here. I should have let you go first.
Careful. So I'm Dan Rao. I've got a little under 20 years probably in helicopter EMS with 2 different companies, one community-based and one university-based. Now I'm a nurse practitioner and a medical director for a countywide EMS out here in Hooterville.
And one of the stars of the Heavy Lies the Helmet podcast.
Oh, right. Yeah, we can't forget that.
Ryan?
Yeah, so my name's Ryan Mueller. I live up in the Boston area. I started working as a flight medic back in 2005, so about 20 years ago. I've worked for 2 different systems. One, Steve and I were counterparts at one of them. It's a consortium model based up in the Massachusetts area, and spent over a decade there. And most recently, last year, was at a hospital-based flight program in central Massachusetts. Currently working as a ground medic for a hospital-based system north of Boston, where I've been for just about 20 years, and sort of splitting my time between that. And I do some work with Air Force Pararescue as a medical instructor with different teams throughout the country.
And last but not least, this is your fifth time on the podcast,
I
baby.
think so,
Everybody in
yeah.
the Boston area
I
is
think
now
when you-
groaning when they're going to hear this voice. Steve Wood.
Yeah,
People
I
are
think
wincing.
yeah, well, thank you, Ryan, for actually providing most of that information. So I started in this helicopter EMS program that Ryan alluded to. That's a consortium system in the Boston area in 1998, and was there until 2008, where I then left that and went into working as a toxicologist for the New Hampshire State Police, which surprisingly was nothing like CSI. I thought it was going to be like I'd get my own car and there'd be all these beautiful people around me. That was not the case. So I only did that for a short while and then went back and just like Dan, now an NP, I work in both EM and critical care. And my EMS experience now is all solely in tactical EMS, a SWAT medic, and I also work for the dive and canine units for both a local and regional SWAT team.
All right. So we got a lot of good experience. And specific to this episode, there's a shitload of HEMS experience on this podcast. I did it for 11 and a half years. People hear me talk enough. So I just wanted to talk about some things like why are there so many crashes happening? What is the state of utilization of helicopter EMS? And is it used too much? Do we have too many bases? This is a wide problem. You could write a doctorate thesis on. So, Steve, I've never known you to be without words or an opinion. So why don't you just say some stuff to start, and then we'll let the panel go where it's going to go. Take a life on its own.
Yeah, I wanted to start because what I want to start with, and we hear all about evidence-based medicine and that, this needs to be academically sound before instituted. We're trying to get pre-hospital whole blood here in Massachusetts, and Ryan's one of those programs that's doing it. But what we kept hearing about was, well, there are no randomized controlled trials or limited data. It's not evidence-based. So my question to all of you and everyone here in the audience is how many randomized controlled trials are there on the benefits of helicopter EMS transport for any condition? And the answer to that is none. All right. So there are no randomized controlled trials really on HEMS benefits. Most of them are observational. It's an old study, 2015 Cochrane systematic review that looked at all the studies done, whether in or trying to support, any benefit of helicopter EMS. And there are no randomized controlled trials. And really, we can no longer do any because now that these systems are in place, you couldn't ethically say we're going to randomize people to either helicopter or ground for certain things. What we know is that it's useful in trauma, and we can get into that, and I'm interested to hear everyone else's opinion. It's useful in pediatric trauma, but we don't have good evidence for really any other condition. And so, it was started to be, it was started as a program to support trauma systems. It's now blossomed from that into something completely different. And honestly, the system that I work for, right, is kind of unrecognizable from the initial charge or mission of that program. And so this is a really significant issue that we need to look at. And we're going to get to this podcast to the many different reasons why we really should be looking hard and close at, when is this a useful resource and when is it not? So I'll start with that, and I'll leave that door open to hear from you guys. I saw some nodding, which is good.
I thought your choice of terms was what it started out as and what it's blossomed into. From my perspective, it's what it's deteriorated into. It's and I agree with you. I think the original concept was trauma patients who are dying and who are wildly unstable. It seems like They ought to do better if we could snatch them up from where they were dying and take them to someplace that will save them. And that seems perfectly altruistic and reasonable. What it is deteriorated into is, I'll buy you pizza if you call my helicopter, or I'll deliver the football to your high school football game, and then you'll think I'm a cool guy, and then you'll call me for all of your flights, 90% of which could probably go by ground, and all iterations between. I can say with some shame that as like you, Steve, I do EM as well in small community critical access hospitals in southern Indiana. I have witnessed the local university-based helicopter program called to this emergency department for a broken hip that's been there 3 days that they couldn't get out by any other means. And I've seen the staff tell the crew, hey, and when you finish this one, turn around and come back. We've got another one for you. So we went somewhere from swooping people up, dying in the middle of the street, to this. And I think that's probably why we're all here talking about it, right?
Dan, one of the things you mentioned that I think is a really important point, underscoring really the evolution of air medical transport. And you referenced ground transport. And I think I'm assuming, and obviously you guys offer your own thoughts on this. I am a big believer that there are patients who benefit from air medical transport. I think there's a patient subset, particularly with trauma patients, and particularly in areas where, tertiary facilities are a greater distance, drive time, et cetera. But I think a lot of what air medical transport has evolved into, and the patterns that we see throughout the country and locally too, are that whether it's for convenience or by programs, doctrine, or policy, where, if you're outside of a particular highway area, it's automatically going to be air transport. The issue that I think we're seeing in the industry is multifactorial, but many of these patients today in 2025, they're going by air. Absolutely could be going by ground. In many instances, by ground ALS, not even critical care. I think there is for sure a place, I can speak to our area up here locally, where helicopters make a lot of sense. I think throughout the country, there's areas that they're desperately needed, but I think there is an oversaturation nationally of air medical providers, helicopters, and many of these patients, I think, to Steve's point on the data, the evidence, it's hard to see some instances where you're seeing, an elderly patient, as one example we often talk about, with a devastating head bleed being moved by air to a tertiary facility for basically to be, determined by the receiving neurosurgeon. They're going to make this patient CMO. And, there's a cost associated and there's a risk associated. That's just one example. We could talk about a lot of different underlying medical conditions that probably very easily and suitably could be handled by ground critical care. Personally, I think helicopters should be the exception, not the rule. I do believe they should exist. In my program, the ground program I work for, we utilize them frequently. They do a terrific job. But I think locally and nationally, helicopters are being used way too much. And until you can truly prove the benefit, I think it's a valid question to ask why this is happening. Because what we're seeing, the whole reason Mike wanted to put this together, unfortunately, people are losing their lives again. We can talk about the cost of flights and all that other, all of the associated metrics. But when people are losing their lives, in some instances, unnecessarily, I think if you look at the type of patients that are being transported, that's a problem.
I mean, I'm just listening to the three of you. And again, my perspective comes from almost really outside of the realm of, we'll just say, commercial air ambulance transportation. And but in my period of time that I was flying, we'll just say from 1991 to 99, and I realize that's quite a long time ago. I could see the evolution of what what is being spoken to today, and just can only imagine how much worse it's gotten. Which is, what I hear is two different things. One, um, why are we flying so many patients from effectively interfacility hospitals? And two, um, what is the cost of that in terms of safety, flight safety, and the number of incidents that are occurring that we see today? And it just seems like when you're being driven by something other than the needs of the patient, the absolute necessity for transportation, you'll find yourself that it always tends to lead toward a dollar sign and the viability of a program, um, which which then opens up the possibilities, the great possibilities of the types of events that have been occurring. Because when you fly so much and you have so many people flying, so many companies that are out there flying, it's just a matter of time. It's just a numbers thing, and then it gets down to how well these ships are being maintained, and how well the crews work together, and all the other things, the dynamics that go along with flying, which is a tremendously, in my mind, it is unsafe. Basically, it can be unsafe just because you're flying in an open environment. When you throw in weather and mechanics and everything else that goes along with it, you have this recipe for disaster. But the better question is, why are we flying so much, or why is there so many flights going on? Just from an outside perspective, a guy who didn't fly commercially in that regard,
You hit the nail on the head.
It seemed like money. It always seemed like money. And I can tell you one incident in particular. We flew here in California, and there was a local air ambulance that had come into town, and they were initially, relatively laid back in terms of how they were responding. But at some point, they realized that this was costing them money, and so they showed up at the office of our commissioner, and without saying too much, they said, "You guys are taking food out of our mouths by transporting people essentially for free, because we didn't charge." And so it changed the dynamic from that point forward. And this had nothing to do with interfacility transfers, because I still believe that is the essence and the bread and butter for like a ground ambulance for me, for the number of years that I rode on a ground ambulance. It was the transfers that really paid the bills. I think the same holds true in air ambulance transportation. And so just the fact that they had these strong lobbyists, and they were able to get the attention of important people's ears, changed the dynamics of the number of air ambulances that ended up in California. And we went from 2 to 4 in the period of time in which I was there. And then it relegated
Now
us
there's
to
40
not as
probably.
much. I imagine. And so it's just seems different.
I counted the ones I could find. I'm sure there's a couple more. There are 28 air ambulances in the state of Kentucky, which is not the biggest state in the country. Granted, it's much bigger than Delaware, but 28. How is it that these people keep putting up base after base after base after base?
I've asked this question to the to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is, you used to have to document the need for a particular service in the Commonwealth, and that's true of many other states as well. And that was eliminated, really to allow for the advancement of increasing these services, not the need for these services, just to increase the volume of these services. And again, I'm most familiar with my own area, and that's why I'm speaking specifically to Massachusetts. But there are I think 7 different helicopter EMS bases in Massachusetts alone. There are only 190 towns in the Commonwealth. So, do we have is there the volume to justify it? There probably is, mainly because of the way that how this system has now evolved or devolved, where, we are now transporting a lot more patients by air than by ground, critical care, or even by ALS, just because it has become easier to do. We have a shortage of ALS transfer vehicles, and so the default sometimes is, well, let's just call for air medical transport because we know we can utilize this. And they also do have something that initially had a really great purpose, which is an undesignated roster with access to 5 or 6 different tertiary care centers. But, that gets misused as well. So, I don't want to have to call and find an ICU bed for my patient. I can just make one call, even though I know this could go by ALS. Instead, I can make one call and I know someone else is going to take care of it. So when you think about how small the Commonwealth is and how many services are there, right, that's problematic. And then, one particular service moved into an adjacent state that already has 2 helicopters. Now there's competition, right? I think that's really incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And the fact that, our EMS oversight agencies aren't thinking about this is really, really concerning to me. It shows that they're, not competently looking at this, because this is why there were so many crashes before. We had competition, we had people taking flights in order to, one up the other service. And if we continue to work that way, this trend is only going to continue.
I think what you speak about is it's a systems problem. I've worked in those small community critical access places, and trying to get a patient out of there is a disaster. You're busy anyway. You have a high volume of high acuity patients. You have low resources, and you call tertiary center number 1, and you go through it. You give everything but your grandmother's maiden name to get through the transfer center to be able to talk to whoever, to the medical ICU that you want to send them to. Then you give a 10-minute dissertation on what's wrong with the patient. And then at the end, they say, well, I'd be happy to accept him, but we don't have any beds. And then you go through it again and again and again. And if you have some one-call place where they'll auto-accept and send a helicopter to come get them, that's like one-stop shopping. And that's what happens. And just for sake of complexity, a lot of people get funneled through there, and then they get a helicopter on top of it, because the first part is getting the patient accepted. The second part is now calling around trying to find an ambulance that can take them. And now 50% of the beds in your critical access facility are occupied by patients that are waiting to go someplace else. So it's a disaster on all fronts. So I'm like Mike, I'm a capitalist at heart myself, but we're killing people with, risk versus reward. And when we're transferring people that literally could go, in some alternate means, just to give you a quick cameo, and I hate telling stories, but I sent a girl with a ectopic pregnancy with a blood pressure of 100 by private vehicle to a hospital that was 45 minutes away, because I couldn't find ground transport for her. And I knew that if she stayed in my little ER, that the helicopter wasn't flying because it was bad weather. I couldn't find ground transport. That was the only way to get her there. And I mean, what a terrible idea. But she was going to stay at my place, and we didn't have operative capabilities for that. So, what do you do? It's desperate situations call for desperate measures. So I'd be interested to hear from you guys about, we all know the problem. The question is, where does the solution lie, I guess?
Hey, Stephen, I have a quick question regarding what you mentioned in terms of you have this default ambulance system ready to go, but you end up transporting by air. There's a significant difference in cost between a ground ambulance and air ambulance. Yeah. Who bears the cost? Does the insurance say, well, we'll pick up the additional cost of that, or is that borne on the patient?
Yeah, I think it's probably a mix of both. That's been a big issue as well. So there have been times where I've said, I can send this patient by ground critical care, but instead a helicopter shows up because the decision was made at a different point that, yes, this, we're going to send it by helicopter because it's faster, or that's the asset we have available. That cost difference is I think 5-fold or greater. It might even be greater. Probably should look that up. But it's a pretty significant cost difference, right? So a patient that I said, this patient has septic shock, they're on these pressors, they need a critical care ground truck to go. It's not time sensitive. You can send it by ground. That's going to cost a few $1,000s. Whereas that same, transport by air, I think is going to be, who I don't know, but it's much, much higher, right? To do that. I think, let's see if I can pull up some quick data here, but I think, it's maybe 15 times, the cost of a ground transport when you think about maintenance and fuel and all of these other things. Now, can we place that blame solely on these HEMS programs? I don't think so, right? Because I have a need, they're filling that need, they're sending the asset that they feel is most appropriate, and the transport's done. So, they're a business. And they're gonna do what they have to do. But yeah, that cost is exceptionally much, exceptionally higher when you consider ground versus air. Can we all place all that blame on those programs? I guess not. But we do, as Dan mentioned, we have to look at this from a system standpoint. And when we just keep falling on deaf ears, when our OEMS, our EMS oversight isn't willing to listen, our legislators aren't willing to listen. The programs grow and grow and grow because that quote unquote need is there, when realistically it's not necessarily there. We just don't have the right resources in place to do the what's actually best for everybody. I feel like we're just in this.
Steve, I think on that point, and to Dan's question on, well, what do we do about it? Which is really, I think, the question. And because there seems to be a lack of, involvement, state and nationally from a legislation standpoint on this industry, I think it's time for all these programs nationwide to really take a hard look in the mirror. Because when we see an accident occur and people, go on to social media and talk about how sad they are and how devastated they are, and I believe them, but yet they don't fundamentally make any changes about how they are sending aircraft out for, these type of scenarios we're talking about, then it's all just talking points until people actually take action. And in my mind, I think one of the things that really needs to start right away, today, is all of these programs, whether they're hospital-based, private service, whatever, they really do need to take a hard look in the mirror and sit down collectively with, their entire staff, pilots, everybody, and look at the basis upon which they're launching helicopters. Really revisit this. Is it absolutely necessary from a clinical standpoint, which at the end of the day, in my mind, is the only reason we should be utilizing any aspect of transport, whether it's ground, air, fixed wing, rotor wing. This group here today, we all started at a time, whether it was in the 90s or the early 2000s, before NVGs, where a lot of programs, there was a lot of crashes in the early 2000s and mid 2000s. And someone referenced it today that a lot of that retrospectively was based on competition. You've got 3 programs at one airport. It's a foggy night. Program number 1 takes the call, says no. Program number 2, who hasn't done any flights in the last week, says, we'll take it. They push weather and you end up CFIT, 3 people are dead. There's been a lot of advances in safety. And Steve, one thing I will say about the program locally in our area, they have outstanding equipment, top-notch aircraft, dual engine. Those are all really important things that I think that group does very well. But more broadly, nationally, I really think we need to revisit the appropriate utilization. And that might be individual entities looking at their protocols. Who benefits most from helicopter transport? Again, we all came from a time when really we were flying super, super sick trauma patients the majority of the time. There was a paucity of ALS in the field, and it made a lot of sense. That's not the case anymore in many areas. ALS is in more areas. Of course, there's rural parts of the country that still might exist. But the bottom line to me is, if we're not going to see change elicited from, legislators and, state EMS agencies, then it's going to come down to the programs. And the hard part is, because it's very clear, many programs are driven by money and their bottom line. So it's going to be a real hard ask of them to say, we're going to not make as much revenue by taking fewer flights. But if we want to start preventing what we're seeing a trend recently, people dying, I think that that's got to be one of the first things that occurs.
There's such a lobbyist program. I'll speak again to California, that the opportunity to legislatively fix these types of problems is hindered um, by lobbyists and their ability to sway, well, even prevent it from even coming up. So I don't think it's even much of a question here. So it's so well protected. But one of the other things I'm listening to here, especially as we're talking about these, we're gonna go. The weather looks really scoshy. If we were not low on flights, we would probably not take this flight. And I think all of you come from a system where you had like more than 2 people on the aircraft. And in my history in flying, the only 2 people that determined go no go was the crew themselves. And if you didn't get 100% go, then you didn't go. Is that what occurs in the air ambulance industry as well? If you've got a crew of 3 or more, or is it just the pilot that says, "I think we can do it"?
Yes. But Sal, let me ask you, because you came from a taxpayer-funded government police helicopter program, would you guys get shit for not flying if you turn down flights? Yeah. So, and I want to full disclosure, and I am not just saying this. I have never felt pressure to flight from any employer I've worked for, and I have never gotten any crap. I personally haven't, but people, since I did my coffee talk where I talked about getting out of HEMS, I've gotten some DMs from people with stories, and I'm not going to read it because I don't want to betray his confidence. I asked him to come on to the podcast. I got a DM or an email from somebody who's in a position of leadership in a program where there have been crashes. I cannot believe that the pressure that is on some crews to fly and the crap that pilots are getting from the aviation vendor. So if a crew turns down a flight, the pilot is getting a call from the vendor, not necessarily the healthcare system that has the program, from the vendor saying, "Why aren't you guys flying? You know, the weather looks fine on our end. Like why aren't you doing this?" And it makes me think about that world famous survival flight flyer that went very public and was on an NTSB report that said, "We have different weather minimums. If a service this was your neck of the woods, Dan. If one service turns it down, call us because we'll do it." It's spooky. It's terrifying to think that this really happens. But from what I'm hearing from my viewership is that it does. It certainly happens. There is pressure to fly, you know. And you said, Dan, out in the Midwest, where I come from, it's close as helicopter for a 911 job. But you said out in the Midwest, it's like, well, you know, Life Air 5 gave us the best T-shirts 2 counties away, but let's call them.
Yeah, it is not closest helicopter here. It's closest helicopter with friends on the helicopter, which is spooky and disingenuous. The program that I came from, everybody knows who I am. I came from the University of Cincinnati, and I can tell you there were more times when our pilot would accept a flight and OCC from the mothership would call and say, nope, you guys aren't doing that. I don't like something here. And our guys would say, yeah, but there's really sketchy weather reporting. We're sure it's fine. And they'd be like, nope, not doing it.
I could see Venus from here.
Yeah, right, right. I felt like the program that I flew for was incredibly safe. And our pilots, that pressure to fly never filtered down to us. And I can't speak for obviously the other programs other than the survival flight snafu that you discussed, which is just horrifying on so many levels. But I can't believe that we're still in a situation. If any of you guys came from the fire service, you remember 20 years ago, if you didn't like the fire department next to you, you would call for an engine from the other fire department. They would drive through 2 cities to get to you because you didn't like them. That is absolutely the way it is for helicopter selection in at least in Ohio. So there's just so many competing factors and so many problems. I think that's why the problems continue, because first of all, I think legislators are hesitant to call into question the heroes who are saving babies' lives all over the state, and to call into question their uh, philosophy or their approach. Nobody wants to take that on, right? It's like donate money to Children's Hospital. How the hell Children's Hospital calls you that, hey, we want to build a new tower and we'll need $2 billion. How much are you sending us? Who's going to say, we don't have any money this year? What, you don't like kids? What's wrong with you? You know? So I think our industry is somewhat similar, that people are hesitant to put us under scrutiny because they look unsympathetic or they don't understand the good work that we do.
It's also like Pandora's box is already opened. I am not bringing politics into this, but it kind of reminds me of the gun control debate. You know how some politicians are like, well, everybody needs to turn their guns in and we need to get rid of them. And people are like, well, there's already 1 billion guns in the United States. Like, it's never going to happen. That's how I feel with air medical programs, because I think if you, to Steve's point, going back to the evidence-based medicine thing, if you looked at how many people actually clinically benefit from a helicopter and you tailored the amount of medical helicopters based on that, you would close down conservatively 3/4 of air medical bases in the United States.
And that needs to be okay.
Yeah.
That
Yes.
has to be okay. Because if it is, and only if it is, whatever the number is, 3/4, 50%, 60%, it needs to be okay, because people's lives will be saved. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're still doing appropriate clinical transport. Is there a place for helicopter EMS? In my opinion, absolutely. I absolutely support it. I did it. I believe in it. I just feel very strongly that it is broadly overutilized across this country. And at a time when we're seeing, unfortunately, so many accidents, I can near assure you most of these programs that are having accidents all thought that they would not ever have an accident until they do, and until someone's lives are lost. And I think it's time to really just, again, take a hard look inward at the overall industry and really make some hard changes and decisions.
And as we look at the last two, at least here in California, the two major crashes that occurred here in the Sacramento area and down in Southern California, as I looked at them, and it's certainly, I don't have the absolute answers, because those answers will come across at some point. It almost seems like there was a component of a mechanical issue, especially the one in Southern California where they lost complete tail rotor authority, and the thing just spun itself into the ground. And so it also asks the question, how much are they able to maintain the flyability, the absolute capability of these aircraft, and who's doing the maintenance and what is being left out. And I think we see that even now, in the airline industry. Like, there's so many flights, and then when you hear about things that are going wrong with a lot of the larger aircraft, it all comes down to some mechanical aspect that hasn't been done, or just was overlooked, because these planes are just constantly in service. And so when you have helicopters that are constantly flying, how often and how well is the maintenance that's being done on them, where you might normally say, listen, we're going to take this aircraft out of service. No, we're going to put a little spit and baling wire on it, and we'll get it back in service, and get this thing flying. That always, I was fortunate enough to be in a system where maintenance was a tremendous part of what we did. And so, in fact, I flew on an aircraft that lasted so long that the manufacturer, Eurocopter, was coming in to, put fiber optic cameras down the stacks and doing x-rays, because they wanted to increase the amount of endurance on a lot of the components, because we had taken such good care of it that they wanted it to last longer, which was part of my reason, like, I got to get the hell off this aircraft, because I felt like I was flying a guinea pig. But I was always confident that the maintenance on the aircraft was always solid. And do you guys have any thoughts on that in terms of of the
Oh,
amount of
yeah.
flight hours that are going on.
Oh yeah, I'm a dirty mechanic's dream. I know nothing, like, but I do. I've always appreciated the mechanics, and they work so freaking hard that it does. We always talk about, oh, the flight crew's tired, they need rest time. The pilots timeout. Does that happen with mechanics? Not really. These guys will be working hours upon hours upon hours straight. A neighboring program to me, who's had a lot of safety issues, there was a big issue because an audit found that a pitot tube was like 200 hours over what it was, over its expiration date, for lack of a better term. I guess there was some issue with the logbook, and the flight crews were like, WTF? If that's wrong and wasn't picked up on, certainly there were issues that needed to be addressed, but the mechanics, they're like, hey, do you know how much work there is for us to do and how much logging there is to do? It's an incredible amount of workload that the crews don't appreciate. And you can have the greatest mechanics in the world when there's that much workload, and they're getting a call from a program manager every 5 hours going, hey, you said this was going to be ready by 1. It's now 3 p.m. What's going on? We talk about pressure to fly. There's an incredible amount of pressure on the mechanics to get that thing flyable.
Yeah, and that just lends itself to all the human factors that can lead to a bad event, you know. And when you stretch it all the way down to how well has this thing been maintained, and then maybe a flight crew or that probably is being, I don't want to say forced to, but like, okay, we've got to fly because we haven't flown much this month. You just kind of start stacking pieces onto that, and it seems like we're setting ourselves up for failure in that way.
I agreed. And to fall back on something actually that both Dan, Ryan, and you, Sal, have touched upon, that pressure isn't just on the helicopter EMS program. A lot of these programs are university affiliated, right? And so when you think about that money flow, is not just for the helicopter EMS program, it's into that university tertiary care system. So there's pressure from those institutions. And if it's not run by a university system and it's, private equity, then, that money flow is to them as well. So that pressure isn't just on the HEMS system. And that's why, we kind of have to look at the systemic issue, which is that, who benefits from all of this? And it's really much more than just the helicopter EMS program. It's the tertiary care centers. It can sometimes be those secondary care centers. We know that, as Dan and I, we work in centers that, we need to move our patients out for one reason or another. We benefit in a way. It might not be monetarily, but we do in some way, because that bed's now available for another patient. I've moved that patient out, and now we can, increase our volume. So it really is just such a tangled web of, systemic issues that is here. I'm with Ryan on this, and that, we need to look at this globally. I think those systems would have a hard time looking at themselves, because, they're so now ingrained in this, but they do need to do it, right? They do need to do it. And we need to also have our legislators become aware of, what these issues are and the systemic issues. Really is something that, needs to be looked at multifactorially.
They call it scalability, not
Yes.
just growth.
Right. Scalability. Right. But there's been, I've seen just growth that was, growth for the sake of growth, because you could do it, they're going to do it. And so, we can put a helicopter base up here, we're going to do it. We can put another one over here, even though it's another state competing with another agency, maybe 2 other agencies. We can do it because we have the funds, so we're going to do it.
To your point, I think we need to reconsider the delivery model. It may not mean laying off people, but it might mean fewer helicopters, more ground critical care, which, at the end of the day, if there's no benefit clinically, which should be the only reason we're utilizing air medical, if there's no benefit, then it shouldn't be done. There's just too much risk and cost associated with it. It's not a very complicated issue in most parts of the country.
Right.
You just look at the geographics. How close are you outside of an urban area with a tertiary facility? What's the ground transport time? What's your availability of ALS? Maybe it should be, that most states have 50% fewer helicopters and perhaps 25% more ground critical care ambulances, because there is a place and a need for critical care air transport and critical care ground transport. But let's just be honest. There is an overabundance, an oversaturation of air medical programs throughout the United States, and specifically helicopters. And, we've yet to see it proved out that there's a clinical benefit to many of the flights that are being taken. It's not a popular thing to say, but I think it's true.
No, 100%. And if you look at all of the data, the only place that there is any evidence that there's any benefit from using helicopter EMS is predominantly in trauma, and that benefit is a 16% odds ratio, so 1.16, improved odds, which could mean the difference between 70% survival versus 73%. Which, if you're in that 3% group, that's great. That's the best evidence we have, and we don't oftentimes institute interventions based on those incredibly low, values. So the evidence is simply not there. I do also agree that it has a place in trauma, has a place in certain time critical events, maybe thoracic dissections, or situations where we want to limit outpatient time. A neonate with pulmonary hypertension. Those are incredibly small percentages and small numbers of call volume. So I agree. We need to shrink that number, have only certain numbers of helicopters, and it should be based on data, right? For organizations that want to drive this data and want data from everyone else, right? You have to look inside and realize, does this data support what we're doing? And then, minimize those numbers of assets, but provide a better service. And then, like you said, maybe it's more ALS, maybe it's more ground, whatever it is. Let's do this the right way and do it reasonably. And that is going to not only improve survivability for those patients who need it, because you're going to have those assets available when they need it. It's not doing something else. You're going to save lives of crews that are dying unnecessarily, and you're going to improve the healthcare system as a whole, because you're reducing the overall cost of transport that has just gone exceedingly high for patients that don't benefit from that asset.
You mentioned appropriate utilization, and my wife's grandmother, 95, died this week. She was on hospice, and in the last 12 hours, my wife's mom, who is a choir director with zero medical knowledge whatsoever, she was like, she's kind of like, seems like she's breathing hard. I don't even know if there's a point to calling the hospice nurse about this. And I'm like, you've got better sense, because there are ER doctors that would call a helicopter for this lady to send her to a tertiary care center. And that's not a joke. So, Steve, that was a good wrap-up point. We're hitting 51 minutes. Do you guys just want to each go through, unless you have something else you want to say, but do you each want to go through, say your spiel, and we'll call it a day or whatever? So, Dan, you've been sitting there with this deer in the headlights look for like 5 minutes. What do you got?
That's the post night shift look.
Yeah.
I think, we talk about trauma and how valuable the helicopter is, and I believe that to be the case, but we still have people that believe that there is a golden hour in trauma. That is still a great talking point for lecturers across America and marketing campaigns. And I always try to explain to people from my very narrow perspective that some patients have the golden 5 minutes. Some patients have a golden hour, and some patients have a golden 3 days. So just because you're in a traumatic event doesn't mean you need a helicopter. I just wonder, in the perfect society, if we had some person that was detached from the capitalistic side of this to determine appropriateness of air medical evacuation before it happens. If you had a guy who could say, like they do in Australia, yeah, I think your ICU patient's sick, but why don't you try this, and try that, and then we'll send you a helicopter in the morning, or call me back if it doesn't work, and then we'll reevaluate. We have, I mean, let's just be candid. I can't help myself. We have people that shouldn't be deciding what the order is going to be at the drive-through window, deciding who we're calling a helicopter for in the middle of the night in the most remote location, and now charged with landing said helicopter in the dark, routinely making that call. That is a problem. And it just goes from there. So that's the part that's most troubling to me, because that's where it starts, and then it just goes. So I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm certainly not the smartest guy in the world, but the first step, I think, like all you guys mentioned, is identifying this is a problem. The more times that you get in the batter's box, the greater chance you have of being hit by a pitch. And let's make sure that when you get in the batter's box, you at least have a bat in your hand. Other than, if not, you're just the target.
I just like to hit the ball every now and then myself. But,
Right.
and I agree with everything you said, Dan. And I think it really, I mean, and it is multifactorial in that, are we talking about the necessity? Are we talking about the, trauma versus medical in terms of transport and this golden hour concept? To me has always been an important part, even though there are times when, and in my own personal experiences where, like, I decided that I was going to land and pick someone up who was under CPR in a traumatic code, and thinking, early in my career that I could save this person, and it was at night, and we flew over a kind of a waste facility, and we sucked up 2 seagulls into our aircraft, and nearly crashed. And I realized then, there are even times when, like, why would I be transporting someone under CPR in a helicopter that's been under CPR on the ground for about the last 20 minutes? Makes no sense. And so there are opportunities for good utilization of aeromedical helicopters, both for trauma and medicine, for medical conditions. And I think it really comes down to almost each individual organization to reevaluate what they do, how they're utilizing it, and maybe understanding that the bottom line isn't about money, but it's about good patient care, good delivery of this type of system, and not being the next major incident that's seen on nightly news.
Brian, what do you got to close out?
I mean, I agree with both Sal, Dan. I mean, I think everybody has really hit some important points. It's a hard discussion to have, but it's time to have it. And
People are going to be pissed.
undoubtedly, and unfortunately, but I think, again, as someone who is an advocate for air medical transport in the right instances, as someone who's done it and really passionate about it, I do see the benefit and the need in certain instances. But I think what we're facing today with the recent, number of crashes, is a real dark time right now. And it's time to take a look in the mirror and just perhaps rethink how this is being executed, and perhaps make some, short-term challenging decisions, but for the broader good of, the medical industry and people's lives ultimately. So, I appreciate you bringing the topic up, Mike. I know it's going to invariably, put another target on your back, and probably all of ours to an extent, but, the discussion needs to be had.
At this point, bring it. I talked about somebody, or Ashley brought up somebody sending a hitman to the house, and I was like, they're going to have to wait in line at the door. All right, let me hit stop, and hold on. Before everybody goes, I got to make sure everything gets uploaded.